everyone. I think we'll get started. Is that a bit too loud? It's okay? Yeah. I'm Cindy Christian. I'm director of the Allworth Institute and co-sponsor of tonight's program, along with the UMD Department of History, Political Science, and International Studies, as well as the Student Political Science Association. Before we start here, I'd like to read to you the UMD land acknowledgement. We collectively acknowledge that the University of Minnesota Duluth is located on the traditional, ancestral, and contemporary lands of Indigenous peoples. The university resides on land that was cared for and called home by the Ojibwe people, before them the Dakota and Northern Cheyenne people, and other Native peoples from time immemorial. Ceded by the Ojibwe in an 1854 treaty, this land holds great historical, spiritual, and personal significance for its original stewards, the Native nations and peoples of this region. We recognize and continually support and advocate for the sovereignty of Native nations in this territory and beyond. By offering this land acknowledgement, we affirm tribal sovereignty and will work to hold the University of Minnesota Duluth accountable to American Indian peoples and nations. Tonight's lecture focuses on the war in Ukraine. This is the first in a year-long look at the war. We will host other lectures about the war and its global implications, so you can grab a list of events in the back, but be aware that we're always updating that, so you can check our website at www.allworth.org for those updates. Now I'd like to introduce Dr. Natalie Belsky. She's an assistant professor in history who was instrumental in making sure that we provide analysis about this war and arranged for tonight's speaker. So please give Dr. Belsky a round of applause.
Thank you, Cindy, and thank you for those kind words. It is my pleasure today to introduce and welcome Dr. Markian Dobczansky. First of all, I do want to say thank you all for joining us and for what I hope will be an interesting, I know will be an interesting talk and a great discussion afterwards. We're very, very fortunate to have our guest here tonight visiting us from Champaign, Illinois, I should add. Dr. Dobczansky is Associate Director of the European Union Center at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, and an Associate at the Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute. Dr. Dobczansky is a historian of the Soviet Union, Russian-Ukrainian relations, and urbanization. He received his doctorate in history from Stanford University and is currently completing a book manuscript titled Between Moscow and Kiev, The Politics of Culture in Soviet Kharkiv. The book traces the development of local identity in Kharkiv, the largest metropolis of the Ukrainian-Russian cultural borderland from 1917 to the 1990s. I think it's particularly exciting to have Dr. Dobczansky here as a specialist on Kharkiv, because Kharkiv, as I'm sure many of you know, has been at the focus of recent developments in Ukraine in the last few months. Dr. Dobczansky has held fellowships at the University of Toronto, Columbia, and the George Washington University. As noted, his research interest includes Soviet Ukraine, the Russian-Ukrainian encounter, urban history, and the Cold War. He has published multiple articles and book chapters, including one titled Rehabilitating Mythology, the Ukrainian SSR's Foundational Myth After Stalin. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Dobczansky to give his talk titled Irreconcilable Differences, Russia's War Against Ukraine and the Question of Sovereignty. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Natalie, for that kind introduction, and also for the invitation to speak here at the University of Minnesota Duluth. I'd also like to thank the Allworth Institute for International Studies and its director, Cindy Christian, for putting together this event, along with the Department of History, Political Science, International Studies, and the UMD Political Science Association. Finally, I'd like to thank all of you for coming today. We're now 6 months into a war that was supposed to be over in a few days. While many commentators were convinced that Ukraine could not survive a full-scale Russian invasion, The assumption has been disproven by events. Ukrainians have rallied to the cause and resisted fiercely, imposing unexpectedly serious losses on the Russian military. Early on, many observers and policymakers talked of a negotiated solution or about offering Russian President Vladimir Putin an off-ramp. As it turned out, this assumption that he was looking for a way out of the war is also incorrect. Putin has shown repeatedly that he will not de-escalate the current situation, even as his strategy lies in shambles. The recently announced partial mobilization, sham referenda in southern Ukraine and occupied territories, and the movement towards annexation are the latest escalations in Russia's war. I mean, you've probably seen news articles in just the last couple of days about each of those things. In fact, at this time, there appears to be no end in sight to the largest war in Europe since 1945. Peace between Europe's two largest countries remains elusive. So how can we understand these irreconcilable differences that have led to this conflict? What makes it so intractable? There are many ways one could answer this question. How leaders have framed their war aims, an assessment of geopolitical interests, even economic imperatives. In my view, all of these explanations boil down to the fundamental issue of sovereignty. Russia and Ukraine have defined their sovereignty very differently since 1991, and if one goes further back into history, one can trace the origins of the conflict all the way back to the earliest years of the Soviet Union. For example, the image on the poster for today's talk is a Ukrainian flag flying over the country's parliament, the Verkhovna Rada. It is hard to find a better symbol of sovereignty than the national flag. The blue and yellow flag of independent Ukraine was first raised over the building in 1991, yet the building itself is not new. In fact, it was built in the 1930s to house the Supreme Soviet of the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, or Ukrainian SSR, after a capital moved from Kharkiv to Kyiv in 1934. The image of the Ukrainian flag flying over a Soviet-era parliament building points us toward the fact that the Ukrainian state has a longer history, going back at least to the Ukrainian Revolution of 1917. And I hope that the importance of this last point will become clear by the end of my remarks. So today I'd like to talk about the history of Soviet state-making, how it integrated the various political claims of its constituent nationalities, including those of the Russians, and how that legacy of entangled sovereignties can help us to understand today's war. It is often difficult for historians to comment on the rapidly developing events of the present, and highly inadvisable for them to predict the future. But when it comes to explaining how we have gotten to where we are, I hope that historical knowledge and insights can be of use to the broader public. Now, that said, today's talk contains observations that should be of interest to historians of the Soviet Union, and I think they're worth considering as the field responds to this war. It has already caused many scholars to revisit the assumptions underlying their approaches to history. The main argument tonight is that the way that Russia and Ukraine define their sovereignties leads to the irreconcilable differences noted in the title. And the metaphor that I've chosen to develop is that their sovereignties were and are entangled. And by that I mean two things: Russia's and Ukraine's irreconcilable contemporary claims to sovereignty, so today, and the ways that the Soviet Union entangled the political claims of its constituent republics with its overall justification of its own rules, so entangled also in the Soviet past. In 2006, the historian James Sheehan published a piece in the American Historical Review providing an overview of what he called the problem of sovereignty in European history. He defined sovereignty as, quote, a set of claims made by those seeking or wielding power, claims about the superiority and autonomy of their authority, end quote. In his telling, the key narrative of European history was not, as it was often told, that of European state building, but the continual definition and redefinition of sovereignty. He claimed that, quote, state-making is the ongoing process of making, unmaking, and revising sovereign claims. Sheehan's article is a comment on the way we tell the story of the creation of the European Union and European integration in general. He ends by citing Anna Marie Slaughter's contention that the European state's sovereignty has become, quote, relational rather than insular. And by this, Slaughter meant that given that so many European states had delegated power to European institutions, Their sovereignty was now no longer simply about pursuing state interests or resisting external influence, but about how they chose to engage with the world around them. In the hopes of suggesting some new ways of thinking about the Soviet Union, I'd like to take Sheehan's discussion of sovereignty as a starting point. Comparing the Soviet Union with the European Union, of course, is problematic and perhaps provocative, and I don't mean to take the comparison too far. Nevertheless, I hope that this talk can suggest a few new ways to understand both Soviet history and the Russo-Ukrainian War. First, I'd like to consider the problem of sovereignty as formulated by Sheehan in Soviet history. And the second part of my talk will talk about Russian sovereignty claims today and the problems that they pose for its neighbors. Third, I'll discuss Ukrainian sovereignty since 1991, focusing both on its most important claims and the way those claims are defined in tension with those of Russia. And then last, in the last section, I'm going to make a few recommendations for the field about lessons we should draw from this brief discussion of sovereignty in the Soviet Union. So let's start with the Soviet Union and its innovative and much imitated model of nationalities policy. What was sovereignty within the Soviet Union? What was the set of claims made by those seeking or wielding power, claims about superiority and autonomy of their authority? The traditional answers to this question have included the party exercises power in the name of the working class. This is probably the first and best answer if someone was going to ask you this question. But sovereignty is never made up of a single claim. In Sheehan's words again, it is a basket of claims. Within this basket, we would also see claims about representing the working class, coexisting with claims about bringing about a world revolution. Closely related, we would also find claims about the supposed scientific veracity of Marxist-Leninist ideology and the superiority of socialist economic planning. In the second half of the 20th century, to these claims would be added the military victory over Nazi Germany and offering an alternative competing model to the US-led capitalist world. There were other less well-known justifications of Soviet authority, though. And the claim that I'd like to focus on, the one most relevant, is the claim that the Soviet Union had solved the nationalities problem. So what was the nationalities problem? The problem, quote unquote, was that upon the Russian Empire's collapse in 1917, many of the non-Russian peoples had sought to go their own way, to create their own political institutions and to free themselves from national oppression under the Tsars. Finland, Poland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania in the West all successfully consolidated independent states outside of Soviet control. Other movements were not as successful, including those in Ukraine and Belarus, the Caucasus, and in Central Asia. The Red Army successfully reconquered these territories and set up Soviet institutions there. But this still left the Bolsheviks with a dilemma: how to integrate this vast and diverse territory that only recently saw armed attempts at establishing national independence. The USSR proposed solving this problem in several ways: by creating a federal structure made up of national republics, organizing Republican Communist Party organizations, staffing school systems to educate children in non-Russian languages, and supporting cultural elites and the production of non-Russian high cultures. Essentially, the full gamut of policies that historians such as Terry Martin, Francine Hirsch, Adrian Edgar, Serhiy Yakelchik, and Adib Khalid have spent the last 30 years bringing to our attention. These policies were expensive, but nonetheless prioritized. They were designed to neuter the political appeal of nationalism across a vast multi-ethnic space. And this set of policies and its claimed success, quote unquote, remained a prominent justification for Soviet rule right up until the end of the Soviet Union. Ascribing any measure of sovereignty to Soviet republics may appear chaotic when they did not actually exercise any measure of independence. And while it is true that the CPSU claimed supreme power within the Soviet Union, historians have spent decades pointing out how power was nevertheless diffused within that system. So there was power centralized at the top, but the Republican elites, local elites, they all were able to exercise a measure of power. Cultural elites, even though they were heavily censored, had a certain degree of discretion in how to create their national cultures, operas, music. And even ordinary citizens exercised some limited form of consumer choice, and authorities paid close attention to what were called popular moods. But the question of sovereignty is not the same as power. Sovereignty is about claims, and here the central party reigns supreme. But did its claims not rest to a certain extent on the continued existence of the institutional structures it set up in 1922 when the Soviet Union was formed? The republics claimed some form of sovereignty and that they were supposed to represent their titular nationalities. And the Soviet Union had created them, and the non-Russian peoples were supposed to be proud and grateful that they had their own nation states and lived in harmony with the other non-Russian peoples of the Soviet Union. And if one pays attention to official sources outside of Moscow, it is striking the degree to which these non-Russian republics celebrated their own existence, the anniversaries of their founding, and often their republics' leaders. Moreover, if we get down below the level of the republics, Soviet cultural policy promised widespread autonomy for all national minorities, especially in the 1920s and 1930s. Jews and Poles in Ukraine, Persian-speaking enclaves living among Turkic-speaking majorities in Central Asia, and numerous minorities such as the Crimean Tatars, Karelians, or Mingrelians, who didn't have their own republics, all of these groups were promised cultural support to one degree or another. Kate Brown wrote about one such Polish enclave, Marchlewsk, within the Ukrainian SSR in her classic biography of No Place. Krista Goff's award-winning book, Nested Nationalism, examines these sub-Republican national movements in the Caucasus, and all of which is to underscore that the Soviet Union's claim to have solved the nationalities question were an extremely important part of its domestic legitimacy. After all, what good would living free of class oppression be if one still encountered national oppression? I should note that the fate of these nationalities without a state was often tragic. Crimean Tatars and Poles were deported en masse before and after World War II, and Jews still faced widespread anti-Semitism and discrimination, for example. But what is important for this discussion, however, is that the Soviet claims about the purportedly harmonious multi-ethnic state that they had designed. And what about Russia? The Soviet Union created national republics in the empire's borderlands, sure, but the place of the Russians within this framework was very ambiguous. They were the largest nationality by population, and they lived throughout the borderlands of the Soviet Union. The answer to this question is that they were given what was left over after national homelands were created for the non-Russians. The historian Yuri Slyoskin famously compared the Soviet Union to a communal apartment. Each republic had its own room, but Russia was confined to the common areas. Russians did not really know what belonged to them and what belonged to their republic. So when the republics closed the metaphorical doors and put up their own flags in 1991, Russians were confused. The Russian Federation was not a national home or a container that Russians could claim for themselves. They were convinced that Russia's claim to the common areas were indistinguishable from claims to the entire apartment. And they had even installed the plumbing and heating in the forms of railroad and industry. In Soviet times, Russia had no Communist Party of its own, no Academy of Sciences except for the all-Union Soviet one, and moreover, it had to share representation with all of the myriad republics, oblasts, and okrugs that were carved into its own territory by Soviet border makers. And examples of this are Chechnya, Tatarstan, Yakutia, and Bashkortostan, which are actually within the borders of the Russian Federation. So as Sheehan notes, there are gaps between the theory and practice of sovereignty. Merely having had a state and exercising sovereignty, of course, are not the same thing. Soviet Ukraine had many of the institutions of a state, example, a parliament, a government, an Academy of Sciences, a ruling Communist Party of Ukraine, and it had its own arts and literary scenes, film industry, school system. In 1945, the Ukrainian SSR even became a founding member of the United Nations, along with the Belarusian SSR and the Soviet Union as a whole. The Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic did not. The contemporary Ukrainian state, what we see today, is inseparable from Soviet state and nation-building efforts that preceded it. The Ukrainian state that emerged in '91 was the result of a combination of Soviet state building, the ardent efforts of anti-Soviet nationalists, as well as the acquiescence of the communist elite that had grown up within the Soviet system. Looking at history here in more detail is instructive for understanding the relationship of Soviet Ukraine and independent Ukraine. In 1917, following the abdication of the Tsar, what became known as the February Revolution, Ukraine experienced its own revolution. It saw the first attempts to set up a Ukrainian state structure within the Russian Empire through the creation of a Ukrainian Central Rada. Rada simply means council and is the Ukrainian equivalent of Soviet. This government was organized in April 1917 and professed a desire for federation with the provisional government in St. Petersburg, which was then in power. Actually, it was called Petrograd at the time. The Rada in Kiev was dominated mostly by left-wing parties, and it represented a broad swath of Ukrainian civic organizations. Voting behavior in elections to the Constituent Assembly in November of that year indicated that the Ukrainian peasantry, the national movement's most important constituency, clearly preferred leftist parties that embraced national demands alongside radical land reform, such as the Ukrainian Socialist Revolutionaries. And this neatly summarizes the two major demands of the Ukrainian Revolution: socioeconomic fairness and national liberation. Following the Bolshevik seizure of power in November 1917, the Ukrainian Central Rada gradually abandoned its support for federalism with the provisional government and moved towards the radical step of outright independence, which they declared in January of 1918. This Bolshevik takeover in Petrograd was followed by a long and bloody civil war, which involved the Red Army, several different white armies supporting the restoration of imperial rule, Ukrainian armed forces, Polish units, as well as anarchist formations in central Ukraine that rejected all states. It was a pretty complicated situation. And the Bolsheviks only gained control over Ukraine after a long and bitter fight, in which tens of thousands of Ukrainians fought for independence. Impressed by the strength of national identification among Ukrainians and convinced nevertheless that these feelings were a transitory phenomenon on the way to socialism, the Bolsheviks adopted the popular slogan of self-determination. And they formalized their new state in 1922 as a federation that included the Ukrainian SSR alongside a Russian SFSR and a Belarusian SSR and the Transcaucasian SFSR. So that was made up of territories in the south of Russia and the Caucasus. So this Soviet-Ukrainian proto-state, which emerged, was the longest lasting state that came about as a result of the 1917 Ukrainian Revolution. It was created as a rival to the successive Ukrainian governments like the Central Rada that were declared in 1917 and 1918. And this concluded the Rada, the Hetmanate, and also the Directory. It was in many ways, and this is the Ukrainian SSR, it was in many ways purpose-built to channel patriotic feelings of Ukrainians into an acceptable Soviet vessel. Soviet propaganda extolled the existence of this state as one of the greatest achievements of Soviet rule, thus indirectly paying tribute to the Ukrainian people's desire to have their own state. So the thinking was you could have a state, but as long as you're not independent and you're part of the Soviet Union, that's no problem for Soviet rulers, right? So Russians in 1917, on the other hand, did not pursue the goal of a Russian nation state. Russian thinkers in the 19th century had imagined that theirs was a kind of universal nation that had a special mission in world history, whether through a moral revival via orthodoxy or through a socialist revolution. The vast majority of this Russian nation was made up of peasants. And so when the Tsar abdicated and a provisional government was put in place, the Russians' major demands were related to social questions, land privatization, ending the war, and addressing the creation of a fair and just economic order. They didn't feel that they needed to be liberated in national terms, right? So they predominantly supported the agrarian-oriented Socialist Revolutionary Party. Russian workers and soldiers, on the other hand, were considerably more interested in the Marxist political movements, such as those represented by the two branches of the Russian Social Democratic Workers' Party, the Mensheviks and the Bolsheviks. Far from wanting out of the Russian Empire, most Russians were interested in radical social and economic transformation within the existing borders. They had not experienced national oppression under the Tsars as the imperial nationality, and thus the provisional government and the Soviet government were both confused and did not know how to respond to the demands from the borderlands from national liberation. And the one thing that they did seem to want, whether they were Bolsheviks or monarchists, was to maintain control over the unified geography of the former Russian Empire. The Whites' main slogan was Russia, one and indivisible, and the Bolsheviks successfully reconquered almost all of the former empire's territory militarily, stopping only in Poland when they were defeated militarily. And the Ukrainian Central Rada, however, the experience of it posed a challenge to the Bolsheviks, and they could not simply defeat the state and reintegrate it. In order to give themselves political cover, and of course to mobilize popular support that did exist for the Bolsheviks, they created their own Ukrainian People's Republic in Kharkiv, in whose name the Red Army claimed to be fighting. And it was this republic that was basically created by the Bolsheviks, won the Ukrainian Civil War with the help of the Red Army. And it ruled the territory of Ukraine quasi-independently until 1922, when the Union was formed. In telling the history of the Ukrainian-Soviet Revolution in some subsequent decades, Soviet historians pointed out that the bourgeois class nature of the Central Rada as justification for why it had to be replaced with a Soviet Ukrainian People's Republic, which, after all, was on the right side of history. In this way, the Soviet authorities could claim to respect the political claims of Ukrainians, while also ensuring that the institutional form it took would remain loyal and dependent on Moscow. This model was followed to varying degrees across the former Russian Empire. Military conquest accompanied by the creation of Soviet institutions that would represent the people who were being liberated. And one is tempted to point to the direct continuity between this policy and today's republics created by Moscow in Donetsk, Luhansk, Transnistria, South Ossetia, and Abkhazia. And because there was no national question in Russia, Russia could simply be portrayed as the homeland of the revolution, and it remained one of the key universalistic justifications for its authority. The Soviet Union's model for harmonizing constituent republics' clashing sovereignty claims was, of course, quite different from that of the European Union, the latter of which is based in law and some degree of respect for real national sovereignty. Unlike the European Union's founding purpose of avoiding war and political violence, I would argue that the Soviet Union was built on coercion and the dictatorship of the party. Its founding came on the heels of war and state collapse, and the violence of revolution was a successful tool for the Soviet leadership. State violence made its way into Soviet administrative policies. Nevertheless, it is important to emphasize that the federal structure remained in place throughout the Soviet period all the way until 1991. It experienced distinct phases, and internal borders between the republics were frequently revised, and when it was challenged, the state resorted to renewed coercive measures to protect union structures. So now I want to talk a little bit about Russia's great power aspirations and the question of sovereignty. So we're moving to the post-1991 period. So the largely unresolved and overlooked status of Russians created complications once the Soviet Union began to collapse. A Russian nationalist movement developed in the USSR in the 60s and 70s, and which was basically concerned about the erasure of traditional values by Soviet modernization. It was largely tolerated under Brezhnev, which made it unlike the zealously policed non-Russian nationalist movements. Yet this biggest national question of all, the Russian national question, did not really find a public hearing until well into the late 1980s, when it emerged in full force in tandem with Boris Yeltsin's skillful handling of it during his rise to power within the Russian Republic. Given this, Russia's embrace of independence took place differently from the other republics. The Soviet Union's numerically dominant nationality took its geographically expansive territory and simply left the Union. The desire of Russians to leave the Soviet Union is often forgotten or glossed over in public accounts of the collapse of communism, as if their resentment and post-imperial phantom limb syndrome were preordained outcomes. At the time, however, many Russians genuinely sought to create a national home for themselves and take their place within the international system as Russia, rather than as a global superpower. Moreover, many Russians were excited about their first chance at democracy since 1917. The Russian Federation may not quite fit the bill as a national homeland because it included non-Russian territories like Tatarstan or Chechnya, but it would be good enough, the thinking went. Many hoped that Russia could remain satisfied with these borders and live in peace with its new neighbors. Though of course it was clear that they never accepted the loss of Ukraine, loss, quote unquote. Moreover, the Russian state borrowed from Soviet discourses of multi-ethnicity, and it promoted itself as a homeland for all Russian citizens, as opposed to simply ethnic Russians. There are two words for Russian in the Russian language. Ruski means ethnically Russian, and Rossiyskiy refers to civic identity. So citizen of Russia is Rossiyskiy. And at least for a time, the Russian state struck a balance between these two definitions. History did not remain on this path, of course, but it was a plausible scenario. The point here is not to say what could have been another way, but simply to complicate our understanding of Russia's inheritance from the Soviet Union and pose a few questions. For example, would the new Russian Federation inherit the Soviet Union's status as a permanent member of the UN Security Council? Would it assume the Soviet Union's foreign debts? The answers to these questions was, of course, yes, but more relevant for our purposes here is the question of how Russia would adapt the Soviet Union's sovereignty claims. Gone now were the claims to leadership of the world revolution and the historical inevitability of communism. There wasn't even a Cold War to be fought anymore. What gave Boris Yeltsin and the new Russian government legitimacy? Perhaps it would be democracy, freedom, and peace, but the 1990s made an adequate answer to this question very difficult for the new Russian state to provide. The cascading economic crises, looting of state resources, and multiple wars in Chechnya were too pressing to work out an answer to this question. The problem of sovereignty remained ill-defined in the 1990s. Putin's vision of sovereignty is altogether very clearly articulated, actually. So people have noted that he believes that only great powers can exercise true sovereignty in the international system. It should seem obvious that Putin could not care less about the sovereignty of Russia's neighbors, and given his treatment of European diplomatic overtures, it would seem he does not even seem to consider their sovereignty very important either. Only the US and China seem to weigh in his decision-making. Europe's status as a major importer of hydrocarbons only matters to Russia insofar as it can be leveraged to pressure the Europeans to acquiesce to Russia's war aims. And it should go without saying, but Russia clearly does not feel constrained by Ukraine's claims to sovereignty. All of which leads up to the first big point. Russia bases its sovereignty on its status as a great power, an exceptional country within the international system. For Putin, the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of its superpower status were not an opportunity to create a sovereign nation state, but rather a deeply regrettable and a source of humiliation. Much of Russia's unhappiness with the international order is that its concerns and policies, i.e. imperial ambitions in the post-Soviet space, are not taken into account by other world powers. Russia defines itself as a great power, and the states surrounding it in its quote-unquote near abroad are small states that naturally fall under Russian influence. One can point to several practical policies that make up its ambitions in the post-Soviet space and through which it tries to carry out its vision of sovereignty. First, Russia claims the right to protect Russian speakers outside of its borders. The policy conflates language use or preference with ethnic identification and completely elides the important differences among national groups that developed during Soviet times and afterwards. Many Russian speakers outside of Russia would identify neither as Ruski nor as Rossiyski, neither ethnically Russian nor citizens of the Russian Federation. The category as defined by the Russian state clearly includes Russian speakers in Ukraine and to a certain extent other countries of the region, particularly in Kazakhstan. But it is also clearly limited. Russian speakers in Alaska or Brooklyn or Berlin are probably excluded, while those in Riga and Narva present a more ambiguous case, since they fall under the NATO defense umbrella. Paradoxically, as Timothy Snyder has noted, this concern for the rights of Russian speakers does not seem to include those within the Russian Federation, whose rights are severely restricted. Then there is a clearly articulated position that the Russian nation includes not just the citizens of the Russian Federation, but also Belarusians and Ukrainians. This idea dates back to the 19th century conception of the tripartite Russian nation made up of Great Russians, Little Russians, and White Russians. These groups purportedly spoke related dialects, shared a religion, and taken together could be counted as constituting a majority of the population of the far-flung Russian Empire. Putin has explicitly justified his invasion by citing this idea, even going so far as to write in a long essay on the topic prior to the invasion. The idea that Belarus and Ukraine have had states of their own since 1991 is completely irrelevant in the face of the idea of their people's ascribed unity with the Russians. Thirdly, Russia arrogates to itself the right to use force abroad. Obviously, they use force within Russia to silence public dissent, punish political leaders of the opposition, and discipline oligarchs that step out of line. But Russia has also claimed the exclusive right to violently repress separatist movements in its own territory, such as in Chechnya. Claiming a monopoly on the use of force within one's own borders is basically definitional for a state, but Russia also claims the right to use force within its near abroad, as it has in Ukraine, Moldova, moderating conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan, invading Georgia, also sending troops to Kazakhstan. And then it also claims a right to intervene farther afield to prop up client states when circumstances allow, such as in Syria. So the question of a gap between the theory and practice of Russian sovereignty remains an open one. Just how much capacity does the Russian state have to enforce Putin's vision? Russia's military has never attempted to inflict a battlefield defeat on a country the size of Ukraine. Does the country have the soft power capacity to maintain its hard power capacity? After this war, the answer will likely be no. Does it indeed have enough hard power capability to enforce any of its claims, particularly in regards to Ukraine? I attempted again to answer no. What remains clear, however, is that Russian sovereignty claims are focused on its status as a great power that influences its neighbors, and this is why it rejects demonstrations of their sovereignty with such vehemence. Its claims to sovereignty remain entangled with the claims of its neighbors, in much the same way that Russia's sovereignty before '91 was entirely entangled with that of the Soviet Union. Now I'm going to turn attention to Ukraine since '91. In a long essay in Daedalus, the Harvard historian Roman Shporlyuk argued that the idea of Ukraine as a nation was that its people, and I'm quoting here, the idea of Ukraine as a nation was that its people should have direct access to the centers of civilization rather than being condemned to an inferior status, that they should be communicating with the world at large on their own rather than through intermediaries, end quote. This rendering of the national idea of Ukraine dovetails nicely with my take on Ukrainian sovereignty, which is, namely, that its sine qua non is that it should be free to make its own choices in foreign policy. This claim is inherently entangled with Russia, in fact is in opposition to Russian claims, for as long as the Russian state defines its sovereignty in terms of being a great power. Ukraine's ability to define its own foreign policy is at the heart of its claims to sovereignty, and events bear this out. The eruption of the Euromaidan protests and Ukraine's revolution of dignity began in 2013, when former President Viktor Yanukovych backed away from a free trade agreement with the EU. This capitulation to Russian pressure, in fact, caused his fall from power. Ukrainians wanted to engage the world on their own terms. And today, the most dramatic demonstrations of Ukrainian sovereignty are President Volodymyr Zelensky's frequent calls with world leaders, his invitations to address parliaments, his rejection of exile, etc. Another major aspect of Ukrainian sovereignty claims is related to the country's indivisibility, which suggests that partition into a Western and Eastern Ukraine is not an acceptable outcome to Ukrainians. A frequent chant heard at Ukrainian rallies is Одна єдина соборна Україна, which means approximately one single, united, universal Ukraine. One might be tempted to say that this demand is hardwired into the Ukrainian national movement. If you look back at the Ukrainian Revolution of 1917, the West Ukrainian People's Republic, which may have had a chance to preserve its own existence in the face of Polish pressure, chose instead to declare an act of union, or akt zluky, with the Ukrainian People's Republic in January of 1919. As Shporlyuk notes again, Western Ukrainian activists never saw themselves in isolation from their Eastern counterparts and could only imagine a national existence together with them. Stalin's fateful choice to integrate Western Ukraine into the Ukrainian SSR in 1939, and to a somewhat lesser extent Khrushchev's transfer of Crimea in 1954, was a paradoxical Soviet enactment of Ukrainian national goals. And it demonstrates the enduring importance placed upon the Ukrainian question by Soviet leadership. In a sense, the Ukrainian SSR was a technology of Soviet rule, but it was also the most prominent example of how important the claim of having solved the nationalities problem was to the Soviet project's sovereignty claims. Ukraine also emerged from the Soviet Union with a large Russian minority and other more traditional national minorities, namely small Jewish, Polish, and Hungarian communities, and the Tatar community in Crimea. Like other post-Soviet states, Ukraine borrowed from the Soviet discourse of multinationality, and the state recognized that citizens came from a multitude of ethnic groups. Ukrainian nationalist discourse coexisted with this broad civic acceptance. Though it did not repeat the early Soviet Ukrainian experiments with investing in cultural institutions for its minorities, there was little discrimination against non-Ukrainians, and even less discrimination against Russian speakers, in spite of what Russian propaganda would have had you believe. If everyone in the country speaks Russian, how can you claim discrimination based on language use? And while there have historically been numerous claims of Ukrainian ethno-linguistic territories that have been beyond the 91 borders of the country, for example, the Polish city of Przemysl and some areas near Kursk and Belgorod in Russia, and of course the Kuban in Russia's North Caucasus, these potential territorial claims have been completely ignored by the Ukrainian state since '91. Ukrainians have largely accepted the borders that their country inherited from the Soviet Union. Now, they may not have been in a position to make any revisions after '91, but the complete absence of these claims from Ukrainian political discourse underscores that Ukrainian sovereignty does not contain irredentist or revisionist claims on the territory of other countries. It's no longer about gaining advantage against your neighbors, but about how you choose to engage with other countries in Europe. So, how are Russian and Ukrainian sovereignty claims related to one another? In the way that I have formulated them here, they're irreconcilable, and hence the title of my talk, Irreconcilable Differences. Ukraine is simply too important to Russia's definition of itself as a great power for it to refrain from interfering in Ukraine's foreign policy and internal affairs, all the way up to the point of attempting to destroy that state, if necessary. Ukraine, for its part, can only pursue an independent foreign policy for itself in opposition to Russia, because it can only access the outside world's political institutions, economy, and culture directly, rather than having them be mediated by Russia. So what does the future hold for Ukraine? Much depends, of course, on subsequent developments in this war. Ukraine has shown that it is committed to escaping Russian domination, liberating its territories now under occupation, and claiming the exclusive right to define its own identity. When measured against Russian war aims, Ukraine's right to engage the world on its own terms is essentially the equivalent of its right to exist. So, we have outlined how the Soviet Union attempted to harmonize the national aspirations of its constituent peoples through its federal structure and through its claims to having resolved the national question. And we have also outlined how Russian and Ukrainian definitions of sovereignty, at least as they are now formulated, are fundamentally irreconcilable. In both Soviet and post-Soviet times, Russian and Ukrainian sovereignties were entangled. In closing, I'd like to touch on some implications for our field of the war and the model of entangled sovereignties that I've outlined above. First, and perhaps most obviously, we need to continue to listen to non-Russian voices in our historical scholarship and in our public commentaries on the war. The Soviet Union was never simply a continuation of the Russian Empire, but rather a supranational state arrangement meant to resolve major dilemmas of sovereignty introduced by the Russian Empire's collapse. Conflating the Soviet Union with Russia strips non-Russians of their agency, and it promotes historical illiteracy about the region that we study. Listening and writing about non-Russian voices challenges the Russocentric assumptions that persist in the field and in our public discourse. Second, we need to continue to problematize the quote-unquote successful integration of non-Russian territories into the Soviet Union. In other words, the appropriation and alteration of their sovereignty claims by the Soviet state. This process was only superficially similar to the voluntary modification of sovereignty undertaken by Western European countries in response to the destruction of World War II. If European countries modified their sovereignty to make it, quote, relational rather than simply, quote, insular, they are correctly seen as having chosen this path for their own reasons. The entangled sovereignties at the heart of the Soviet federal structure were rather different. Because of the highly centralized Soviet political system, it was not acceptable for Soviet Russia to enter into federal relations with non-Russian republics, such as the Ukrainian People's Republic. Rather, these competing states had to be destroyed, and new Soviet republics had to be declared to replace them. Only could these Soviet republics enter into a union structure. This was the Soviet state's grotesque tribute to Ukrainian sovereignty, and it was a far cry from a gift from Lenin to the Ukrainian people, as it would later be portrayed by Vladimir Putin. In other words, they had to do this. There were serious political reasons for them to create a Ukrainian republic within the Soviet Union. Third, we need to continue to invest in area studies and value the insights that specialists focused on a single geography can offer us. Learning Ukrainian or Kazakh should not be seen as a niche project, but rather as a necessary supplement to a thorough knowledge of Russian if one wants to study Eurasia. We also need to alter how we train specialists. When I applied to graduate school, there was a requirement for those who wanted to study Russian and Soviet history to know Russian as well as French or German. Now, I'm all for knowing French or German, but isn't it also just as important to know a non-Russian regional language? Area study centers can continue to point out to academic departments the value of studying non-Russian languages and cultures. And lastly, I want to stress that we may be witnessing a real historical turning point. The resolution of the Russo-Ukrainian War will determine many things that we will come to regard as natural. To paraphrase Fiona Hill in one of her many interviews during the war, in much the same way that the War of 1812 confirmed the independence of the US from the British Empire, this war will confirm Ukraine's independence and make it much more difficult to undo, no matter what form the Ukrainian state takes in the long run. It is essential to both keep up with the constant flow of news and at the same time to continue to think about the significance of events for our own understanding of the world in general and Eurasia in particular. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Dobczansky. Very interesting and thought-provoking talk. So we do have some time, and we'll dedicate some time to Q&A. So please be thinking about questions that you have for our speaker. I do want to give Dr. Dobczansky just a minute or two to relax. And I wanted to invite Bob Sherman, who's a Duluthian and who's working on a really very important project with having to do with Ukraine today, to just say a few words about his foundation. So Bob, if you could come up here for a minute.
Thank you very much. As Dr. Belsky said, I'm Bob Sherman. I am the president of the Linda J. Sherman Foundation, which was named after my wife, who died here at Solvay Hospice House on August 9th of last year. I have been working in and out of Russia since 1974. I studied Russian language and history and political science at Southern Methodist University. And I went for the first time to Russia, the Soviet Union, I should say, with my professor, Dr. Ilya Alexandrovich Mamontov. He's a Latvian from Riga who immigrated to New York back in the 50s. Dr. Mamontov took us throughout most of the Western Soviet Union, including to Kiev, which I only knew as Soviet Russia at the time. I've had several experiences there since then. I practiced law for a number of years and represented some companies that had legal disputes in the Soviet Union, but perhaps my most important work there was through Rotary International. I went with a number of Rotarians to open a school for disabled children in Kambarka, Russia, which is on the western side of the Ural Mountains, about 11 years ago. And we opened that school. Dr. Paul Deputy, who was then the Dean of the College of Education and Human Service Professions here at UMD, went with me along with others. We helped a young Russian girl, Dasha Kostina, come here for surgery at Essentia to correct scoliosis and to help improve her cerebral palsy. So I've had a lot of experience in Russia. When the war started, something told me that I needed to get involved in that, not on the Russian side, of course, but thinking about how I might help the Ukrainian people. So I worked with a number of Rotarians to start a mental health clinic in Konstantin, Poland, which is just south of Warsaw. And we did that. We opened the clinic with some help from a local university and quite a lot of funding from Rotary. Once we got that going, I started thinking, of my wife's death, and I started thinking that perhaps there would be a need for help for hospices and palliative care centers in Ukraine. So through the help of some friends in the city council in Lviv, Ukraine, I came upon Second Medical Union, which is part of the municipal hospital system there. I went there, and I've been working with Second Medical Union since March. What we do is work in 3 areas, in hospice and palliative care, but also in mental health and physical therapy. I started a foundation, Linda J. Sherman Foundation, some months ago to expand our ability to bring in resources of all kinds. We've recently formed a collaboration with Doctors Without Borders, which I'm really proud of, and through a couple of doctors in Kharkiv and in Odessa. We'll be going to Odessa on the 24th to train family practice doctors, psychologists, and others to deal with soldiers and families that are suffering from severe PTSD. So I'm looking forward to that trip with some trepidation. There were drone attacks just this last weekend in Odessa. It's a beautiful city, port city. You've probably read about the grain ships heading out from there to all kinds of places around the world. But this collaboration with Doctors Without Borders is extremely important. We're working with other hospitals even today in Kharkiv and in Kiev, military hospitals, to bring the same sort of training to their doctors. We have a collaboration. I'm a hospice volunteer with St. Luke's here. We have a collaboration between nurses at St. Luke's Hospice, and we do online trainings of hospice and palliative care nurses in Lviv as well. And most recently, we have worked with Second Medical Union to identify wonderful physical therapists who will be coming here to the College of St. Scholastica and pursuing some doctoral level courses that our foundation will fund, and she'll also be working in the level 1 trauma center at Essentia with patients and hopefully also down in the Twin Cities. Then she'll go back and train her colleagues in Second Medical Union. So we're going to continue this for the duration at least of the war. The war is not going to end anytime soon, and if it does, if it were to end miraculously tomorrow, there would be millions of Ukrainians suffering from long-term PTSD. So we unfortunately have quite a job ahead of us. But it's good work, and I'm really pleased to be supported by Doctors Without Borders, by Rotary, and others who are really making this work possible. Some people say I'm crazy for going to places like Odessa, but it seems like a calling. It seems like the right thing to do. And, I've fallen in love with Ukraine. The Ukrainian people are delightful people. I don't see them as Rossiyski. I don't see them certainly as Ruski. I see them as Ukrainians, and they see themselves as Ukrainians. A good friend of mine, Olya Krivitska, who works for our foundation in Lviv, recently developed COVID, and I was really worried about her. And she kept texting me and saying, "Bob, don't worry about me." She said, I'm a strong Ukrainian woman, and COVID is afraid of Ukrainian women. And I think that's probably right. I admire their strength. I admire their resilience. And it's truly a pleasure to work with them. I met Dr. Dobczansky last week when Mara Palesits was here previewing her film down at the Duluth Superior Film Festival, and it's a wonderful film. She's from Riga, and she's been tremendously helpful to me in recent weeks in terms of continuing with that. I'll end by saying that if you're interested in learning more about our foundation, we're having a global celebration of our foundation's first year. It will be in 4 locations. I'll be in Lviv, but we'll have venues at Barker's Island, across in Superior, at Bethlehem Lutheran Church in 2 Harbors, and down in Hopkins at the Hopkins Pavilion. You can come join us. We'll be connected online. We're going to have a celebration with Ukrainian music, with art prepared by children from the Proctor schools, from schools in 2 Harbors, and some absolutely fantastic music. I met an Orthodox priest in Lviv some weeks ago, and I was telling him about this event and asked him to have his church join us. And he said, well, do you want us to do anything, you know? And I said, well, you know, maybe some music or something like that. And to my astonishment, he said, well, how about if I perform? And I thought, well, I don't know about having an Orthodox priest perform. You know, what do you do? Do you sing? You play an instrument? And he said, well, I actually do both. And I said, well, can you send me, you know, maybe a video or something? Well, he has a YouTube channel. His name is Father Łukasz Lesniak. He's Polish. And he's a rapper. He's really good at it. He's somehow put together traditional Orthodox music and 21st century Ukrainian rap. So come and see him perform online at noon. Barker's Island is the closest here for you, and we'd love to have you there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Bob. And I'm happy to moderate questions. Please just feel free to raise your hand. And questions for Dr. Dobczansky. If you can speak up, that would be great. I should take off my mask. If you can speak up, that would be great. And I will try to repeat if needed. So in the back, please. Yeah.
In the beginning of this war, Putin said NATO had to stay out of Ukraine and Finland. It looks like this war has drove Finland and Ukraine to want to join NATO. What is your thoughts?
Yeah.
So maybe if I can just restate, I don't know, for the purposes of the video. The question is about the question of NATO. NATO unification or joining NATO, I should say, the way that it prompted the war and how it has affected the Finnish-Ukrainian relationship.
Great, yeah, thanks for the question. Finland and Sweden both putting in an application to join NATO was not something that was on anyone's bingo card prior to this war. And the fact that they both have put in an application actually represents a pretty serious geopolitical setback for Russia if it sees itself as a competitor to NATO. These are 2 large North European states. Finland has something like 860 miles of border with Russia. Finland and Sweden both have strong, modern militaries that can contribute to NATO missions of defense, right, and peacekeeping. So those things are a pretty significant setback. Now, Ukraine, support for joining NATO in Ukraine has always been very high among the elite in the state. The state policymakers, the statesmen, the people in the foreign ministry have always defined Ukraine's foreign policy as moving towards the EU and NATO in tandem. Now, support for NATO, Ukraine joining NATO in the early 2000s was pretty low. It was a minority support, right? 20%, 30%. But in Ukrainian polling, many people do often answer, I don't know, or I haven't made up my mind yet. So there wasn't a huge, 80% opposition, right? A consolidated opposing viewpoint. It was just that people didn't know enough to have an answer. In recent years, that number has steadily climbed, and currently, right, it's probably, the last figure I saw was 60%, and it's probably only getting higher at this point, because one thing that you do see in Putin's and Russia's efforts to influence events along their border is that they don't invade NATO countries, because they know that the consequences would be severe, and so it's probably Ukraine's best option in terms of protecting itself in the future.
Thank you. Peter?
So earlier in the talk, you mentioned how the creation of the Ukrainian SSR within the Soviet Union was a tool for the Soviet elites to basically solve this nationality question while maintain their legitimacy. I haven't researched this, but I remember reading about how as Stalin was consolidating power to take his role as premier, he was attempting to garner support from different elites within the Soviet Union, including those elites within Ukraine. How was the question of Soviet sovereignty dealt with in the context of needing support from these local elites, while also having to define themselves as being subordinate to the true Soviet political elite?
Yeah.
So the question has to do with Soviet nationality politics and the way in which Stalin specifically had appealed to local national elites in an effort to legitimize and strengthen the Soviet Union. Did that address this? Yeah.
Great. Well, thanks for the question. It's a great question. I think that, again, here the difference between elites and institutions is really crucial, because the institution of the Ukrainian state had a continuous existence, but the elite did not. And in fact, in the 1930s, something like 90% of the members of the Ukrainian Central Committee at the beginning of the decade were dead or in prison by the end of it. So Stalin effectively destroyed the elite and replaced it with one that's more compliant, right? And at the same time, they were all running the Ukrainian state. So again, I think that the sort of structural factor of Ukraine having a state continued to be part of the calculus of the regime. And if Stalin was going to be purging and replacing national elites all across the Soviet Union, which he did, then it didn't really matter, right? That he was destroying them as opposed to trying to gain their sympathies, right? So, does that answer your question? Yeah, good? Okay.
Thank you. Logan?
So I know earlier today when you came to speak with our class, after you were done talking, she mentioned how Russia has stated that if they must, they will use their nuclear arsenal. With Ukraine being fully surrounded by NATO members, do you think if Russia keeps pushing for the threatening of use of nuclear weaponry, that will not only push the United States, but most of NATO to get more involved within the war?
Thank you. So the question is about the potential effect of Russia's nuclear threats to draw in not only the United States, but Ukraine's NATO neighbors into the conflict.
Yeah, so the U.S. has communicated privately and in public to the Russians that if they use a nuclear weapon, that the response will be, in the words of the National Security Advisor, catastrophic. And what many observers have taken that to mean is basically if there's a tactical nuclear weapon used in Ukraine, the U.S. will destroy the Russian army in Ukraine, right? So that's a pretty serious escalation and a pretty serious threat, right? And obviously, from the very beginning, the U.S. has been pursuing a policy of deterrence, of credible threat making in response to Russian escalations. And that's sort of the state of play. Now, in terms of using a nuclear weapon, I mean, it's hard to imagine how that would help Russia's war effort in any significant way. They've already destroyed, depopulated Mariupol. They've already carried out massacres of civilians. They've already shown that they're willing to use extremely violent methods to gain their war aims and terrorize the population. Rocket attacks against infrastructure, schools, hospitals, all these things have been used by Russia in the war. So if they use a tactical nuclear weapon, all it will do is broaden the conflict to include Ukraine's neighbors. Irradiating a huge area of Ukraine means that I don't think it's lost on Putin or decision makers in Russia that it's a neighboring country and it's close by. So who knows which way the wind would blow? And it's a pretty dangerous thing to throw around radiation. So I think there's still factors militating against it, but I don't think that the threats should be ignored or not taken seriously. I think they deserve a response.
Dr. Dan Nolan, and then Dr. Paul Sharp. Dan?
I have a quick question. Thank you for this rich talk, first of all, but I just wanted to follow up on that question and your answer. Can you speak more to the question of sovereignty in Ukraine and how the collaborative use of military force is making more complex the outlook of what will happen in this war, as well as our understandings of Ukrainian, Russian, and U.S. sovereignty, thinking about the use of the HIMARS batteries of missiles that appear to be consequential in what's been happening over the last several months.
Thank you. Correct me if I'm restating this incorrectly, but your question is about the collaborative use of military force in the current conflict and how it impacts questions of sovereignty. Yes. Is that right? Great.
Yeah. So the Ukrainian war effort has been aided greatly by the supply of U.S. weapons and weapons from all over Europe, and I suppose in some way, sovereignty is all about the claims that states make anyway. So I think that if these weapons are helping Ukraine to win, it's just confirming that Ukraine has allies and that Ukraine can hold its own against the Russian military. It's sort of, I'm not sure that really like takes anything away from Ukraine's goals, right? And it's providing a practical capacity to pursue those goals in war. Now, as far as like nuclear weapons goes, in 1991, Ukraine did have the third largest arsenal of nuclear weapons in the world, and they successfully denuclearized those weapons, decommissioned them, and in return, Russia, the UK, and the US offered it security assurances, not guarantees, but assurances. So I think that having a nuclear weapon is the ultimate and final guarantor of a nation's sovereignty, right? That's why states pursue them, because not only does it provide them with a kind of trump card in terms of defending themselves, it also allows them to make these kinds of threats, exactly, right? Which is that, like, we will use them and you can't respond in any significant way. So unfortunately, what the precedent that seems to be being set here in terms of nuclear proliferation is that if you give up your nuclear weapon and you have a powerful neighbor that has them, then you are vulnerable, which is increasing the incentives for countries all over the world to pursue nuclear weapons. So it's not a great outcome here. And it's another reason why the U.S. has a direct interest in helping Ukraine to defend itself, because the U.S. still has an interest in non-proliferation to be concerned about.
In fact, to your earlier point, if I may interject, these alliances that Ukraine is forging speak to its ability speak to its power and sovereignty as a player on the international stage. Of course, the problem is that Russia perceives it within a very different great power politics lens, which, again, somewhat irreconcilable. Dr. Sharp?
Thank you very much for the talk. Very, very interesting. Could you use your historian's insight to say a little bit about whose side is time on in this conflict?
Time. Oh. Very succinct question. Whose side is time on from a historical perspective?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I mean, the longer that Ukraine holds out, the more difficult it is for Russia to muster the kind of force it will need to actually win the war, right? So Russia can only muster increased forces at a cost to its regime's stability and legitimacy domestically. And we're seeing that with this mobilization. Before, people in Russia could live as if only something was happening very far away. This was a professional military, and it was, a special military operation, right, quote unquote. Now, with a mobilization going on, it's much harder for average Russians to keep their distance from this, and that means that the stakes for them of what their government is doing are way higher, which leads to outbreaks of resistance and violence, which, I don't want to overstate how threatening those are to the regime's stability, but they are the beginnings of something, right?
Yeah, I think if those lines at the borders are any indication, time is pressing for Russia. But of course, it's a big country, so it's hard to gauge what that really tells us in the long term. I think I had a hand up in the very back, and then we'll move here to Dr. Deputy.
How do you think Europe would react if Russia stopped supplying them with natural gas in the coming months?
Great, thank you. The question is about how Europe will react if Russia stops supplying them with natural gas in the coming months.
Well, Europe is working as fast as it can to reduce its dependence on Russian oil and gas. The speed with which some of these changes have taken place in terms of policy is really, it's really surprising. And it's also unsurprising because everyone knows that winter is on the way and they will need supplies of natural gas to heat, Europeans' homes, right? So clearly this is a tactic of blackmail on the part of Russians, and it's not lost on the Europeans. But the Europeans also have their own interests. The European countries themselves have their own interests in this issue, right? So you see European leaders like the European Commission struggling to keep in line countries that have a greater dependence on Russian oil and gas than some of the countries in the West, like particularly Hungary, right? Which is at some point was 90% dependent on Russian oil and gas. So it's really a question of how successful the European Commission can be in continuing to keep its member states coordinated in terms of this. And I do think if Russia cuts off the gas, it'll be an escalation. It'll be an escalation that has unpredictable consequences. On the one hand, it could lead Europeans to blame Russia and increase the desire of publics in Europe to resist Russia and punish it. On the other hand, it could lead to just economic turmoil and people blaming their governments for not addressing the issue of oil and gas. So it's unclear how that would play out if Russia did carry out a total block on exports.
Thank you. I think partly the other side of it is that also has economic ramifications for Russia as well. So it's not a one-sided thing. Yeah.
I appreciate your very clear presentation. I could follow it. I learned a lot, and a lot of it, of course, was about Russia and Ukraine, and then later on, the United States, what they're doing, entered in. What kind of players or what kind of influence or involvement are playing in this, should I call it a game, in the Middle East and China? How are they fitting into this?
Yeah. So the question is about the position or the relevance of Middle Eastern and Middle Eastern and countries in China in this conflict.
So I want to separate those two things. I think China has taken Russia's side in general on this issue, but their support has limits, and I think that they have overriding priorities in being able to push their own geopolitical interests in their neighborhood, right? So their big concern is Taiwan and being able to integrate Taiwan at some point in the future. And if Russia's experience with Ukraine is any kind of indicator or predictor, it's going to be extremely difficult. And it makes violent moves to reintegrate territories look bad and not look attractive. So China is not exactly thrilled with Russia right now, but it's maintaining at least a kind of benevolent neutrality. It's buying more Russian oil and gas, not refraining from criticizing it in the UN Security Council, all those things. So China is present, certainly, and the crisis is likely to have made Russia a junior partner of China rather than an equal partnership. So they're certainly present. In terms of the Middle East countries, I think with Europe becoming suspicious of its dependence on Russian energy, the field becomes wide open for the Middle East to replace those supplies in Europe, right? So I think that their interests, they don't really have a dog in the fight except to try to capitalize on the market disruptions that are caused by tensions between Russia and Europe.
And though I'm not an expert in this, I think the question of sovereignty is particularly relevant, particularly to the Chinese discussion, right? This is something that they're very
Absolutely.
worried about. So I see a few questions. We have one over here, two, and then two here. Go ahead.
Yes, thank you. If I remember right, there was actually a Crimean SSR that Khrushchev kind of turned over to Ukraine, right? So I'm unclear on this part. Is there any kind of overlap with that historic territory and the current war zone kind of hot zones now, or is it mostly the 2014 gains? Or further than if this keeps going the way it's going towards Russia right now, is there any chance of those 2014 gains of the annexation being rolled back? Is there any future for that sort of autonomy for those people?
So if I understand correctly, the question has to do with the transfer of Crimea, the relevance of the transfer of Crimea to Ukraine by Khrushchev in 54, yeah, and then the 24, and how the current situation might impact the position of Crimea in post 2014, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
So Crimea was transferred to the Ukrainian SSR in 1954 by Khrushchev. It was the last piece of a 1991 Ukraine to have become united with it, right? So in many ways, Crimea was always an exception within all of the other Ukrainian regions. I think it's possible to see a future where Crimea is reunited with Ukraine, and the Ukrainians certainly make that clear that that is their position and their priority. It remains to be clear to be seen how defensible it is for Russia, given Ukraine's battlefield successes, right? Obviously, it's going to be an extremely difficult thing for Ukraine to retake all of its territory, including Crimea. But it's certainly, this war has definitely ended the party for Russia when it comes to Crimea being reintegrated peacefully. There's been rocket attacks and strikes within Crimea, and that has punctured the aura of inevitability and invincibility that Crimea sort of represented for the Russian state. So I think it's possible to see Crimea reintegrated. The other territories that are under occupation, there really wasn't any kind of administrative or ethnic justification given for breaking these territories away from Ukraine and fomenting this war in them, right? I mean, Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, Kherson, all these places were constituent parts of the Ukrainian SSR from the very beginning. So it's harder for the Russians to make a credible claim about those territories wanting to rejoin it than it was about Crimea. Because Crimea had always had an ethnic Russian majority, and support for Russia there was measurably higher than it was in those territories. So this is really uncharted waters, and it's going to be much more difficult for Russia to hold on to these territories than it was to take Crimea in the first place.
I also think it's a dangerous sign about the proliferation of these post-Soviet liminal states that are contested areas, which tend to be really problematic on so many levels. Brenna?
Towards the end of your talk, you kind of mentioned, compared it to the War of 1812 in terms of the USA's first big war against their previous owner, whatever. So I'm wondering if you think after this, if there's a path towards a future allyship between the Ukraine and Russia once the war's been resolved and Ukraine's kind of solidified their independence, hopefully.
Thank you. So the question goes off of the comparison with 1812 and the situation, U.S. asserting itself against its former imperial power, and whether you see their hope for a potential peaceful alliance between Russia and Ukraine in the future. I had a question that I wanted to let the audience ask, but I'll tag it onto this because it's very relevant, of whether you see there any kind of hope for a Russian for a Russia that goes back to that sovereign national vision that you talked about in the 90s, and whether we see any indication that there is a hearkening back to that, any movement on that front of the idea that kind of Russia could emerge.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, it's a bit of an unexpected question, actually, and it's really good for that, because it's hard to imagine anything in the near future where Ukrainians are interested in doing anything politically, internationally with Russia, right? This war has been an incredibly traumatic experience and has really severed a lot of the links that had connected Ukrainians to Russians in the past. But at the same time, right, 1812, I mean, the US and the UK are allies, right, and very close allies at this time, right? So I think what the difference is, though, is that the 1812 forced the UK to accept the loss of the US. They didn't go after the US and try to undermine its state after that. It's essentially like over the long term, common interests brought the US and the UK back together. And the UK had to accept that the US was independent. That's the only scenario in which I can see Ukraine and Russia having a rapprochement, is if there's a real rethinking in Russia of its imperial legacies regarding Ukraine specifically, and also all of its former imperial possessions. That goes for the Baltics, that goes for Central Asia, that goes for the Caucasus countries. So, I mean, it really is up to Russians to rethink their imperial and colonial inheritance from the Russian Empire, and also, in a very strange way, this from the Soviet Union, because the Soviet Union claimed to be anti-imperial, so they have to think about what it meant to be the leading nationality in the Soviet Union when they were told for decades that they were actually helping these other countries, and that everybody was living together harmoniously with the national question being solved, right? So that's a really hard thing, and it'll take a long time for Russian society to go through this rethinking.
I mean, to that point, in 91, I think, we have the establishment of the Commonwealth of Independent States that was composed of many of the post-Soviet states, right? Kind of on some kind of model like the British Commonwealth. Of course, it didn't really work that way. So that was sort of a failed...
And Ukraine never formally joined.
Oh,
really?
It
was only an observer
right.
in the Commonwealth of Independent States.
So, I mean, I don't know if that institution could potentially come back to life. We're going to wrap up in a few minutes, but I do want to take a couple of final questions. I know we had a question here.
My Ukraine history is a little rusty, but I'm wondering about the impact before the revolution. It seems, my recollection is that the Ukraine area is pretty messy, being overrun by Polish, Swedes, Turks, and changing. When you look at it through that lens, it gives one the impression that it's just always going to change, and you might not want to mess around in there because it's just going to change again.
Mm-hmm.
So those, what do you think of those impacts on the future? Or is it maybe everything's new and different now and we don't have to worry about that past?
So I guess to summarize, if I may, that Ukraine has historically seen a great deal of occupation and instability, and whether that, and what hope there is for that legacy to come to an end, and for stability there.
What's the impact?
Right, the impact of that history of long history of occupation and conquest.
Yeah, I mean, I really appreciate the question because it sort of allows me to say something which I think isn't said enough, which is that Ukraine is perfectly normal in this regard. Ukraine is similar to every other country in Europe, which you can point to and say that, certain parts of Italy were dominated by this great empire, certain parts of Germany were dominated by this other empire, the Czech Republic was part of the Habsburg Empire for centuries. So there's always a chance for countries to become sovereign, consolidate their independence, and overcome this legacy of instability. You can also see this in the history of let's say like Ireland, right? Ireland was also under British domination for so long, and there's still lots of unresolved issues there. But for a couple of decades now, Ireland has largely been at peace with the UK, and that could all come unraveled as a result of Brexit and with the status of Northern Ireland, given the maybe Scottish independence. So these things do come and go, and I don't think that there's any path dependency in terms of imperial legacies that doom Ukraine to uncertain future. At least that's what I can say as a historian, is that these things do come and go over time. So thanks.
Yeah, I think we were actually talking earlier, given my own interest in Jewish history, but we're talking in part about the incredible ethnic diversity that existed, particularly in Western Ukraine, though not just Western Ukraine, in part as a result of these various populations that interacted there. It is important to remember that throughout the 20th century, in part as a part of the politics of, the actions of Hitler and Stalin, the Ukrainian territory has become much more ethnically homogeneous. That's not to say that it's totally ethnically homogeneous, but it's certainly less diverse than it was. A lot of populations have been killed, murdered. Many have left. So in many ways, part of that minority question, it looks very differently than it did in earlier periods of Ukrainian history. I think we had a question. Bob had a question, and then that will be our last question.
Yeah, this is really more of a comment. It goes back to some of your comments on nuclear threat. My perception, having been over there, is that there is a lot of fear on the part of ordinary Ukrainian people about a tactical nuclear attack. Many of them have a plan A, a plan B, and a plan C for getting out of the country should that occur. I think that is part and parcel of Putin's plan. When he realized that his tanks and his infantry were not going to be able to take Kiev in a matter of days, I think he shifted his approach to say, well, then I'm just going to wear them down psychologically. And missile attacks, the atrocities, the rapes, killing the children, that sort of thing are intentional. There are radio intercepts that prove that. And it's going to go on, and if nuclear threats are part of that, I wouldn't at all be surprised. But he's underestimated Ukrainian people, and I think that what happens every time he does something like this is that it just strengthens their resolve, and they have to continue to believe in us and in the EU to believe that we're in it with them for the long term here. Because if we were to say, we're done, there's this gas thing in Europe is going to cause us to leave, or the Germans to leave, or whatever. I mean, let's face it, their gas prices in Warsaw are now 15 times higher than what they were this time last year. So there's real pain there.
Yep.
German inflation is well into double digits because of that. So if Putin's trying to play this game, he's playing it well, but he's not playing it well enough. Because if we don't stand with Ukraine, then we will see Lithuania, we will see Latvia, we will see Moldova, and eventually Poland fall, because Putin will not stop. And I think that's part of the Biden administration's philosophy on all of this. So my question is, don't you agree?
Thank you. So, the comment has to do with Putin's efforts to demoralize Ukrainians and others through both economic pressure, violence, and nuclear threats, and its effect on Ukrainians and others, and its the potential reverse effect than the one that he intended. It was more of a comment. I don't know if you want to take a minute to say a few words, and then we'll wrap up.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's hard to disagree with any of that and your analysis. I mean, I think what can't be achieved on the battlefield is where the battlefield shifts to the psychology, right? And that's been a pattern for Putin for a long time, and the Russian way of war for a long time. So that's the unfortunate reality, and I agree with you that the EU and the US need to be cognizant of that, and they need to take these threats seriously and formulate coherent policies for countering them. So thank you for the comment.
Thank you everyone for attending, for your excellent questions, and I just want to take this opportunity to again thank Dr. Dobczansky for sharing his expertise with us today. Thank you very much.